I'm going to talk about is something that I call curricularizing language. And I'm going to talk about language. Of course, we're all very excited about learning more and more about language. So what I'm going to do is to talk about the process of what I call curricularizing language and all of the interacting mechanisms that are part of that process. And I should tell you that my PowerPoint is an exercise in speed reading. So you're going to be reading along with me. I invite you to consider why language is not an ordinary school subject. That is the main point of my presentation. And I want to conclude with examples of possibilities for supporting English language development for equity by describing work on integration of language and content. So I'm going to say quite a bit about the ways that we see and hear language. I'm going to claim that we not only hear language, we see it as well. But I'll say a little bit more as we move forward. So as we get started, here are the questions that I want you to consider. What if the ways that we think and talk about language are wrong? What if our views about good and bad English actually reflect our perspectives on the racial and ethnic characteristics of our speakers? What if drilling new learners of English on vocabulary and grammatical structures does not help them use the language in order to learn? And what if English language proficiency assessments can only tell us where a student scores with reference to the hypothesized sequence of development on which the state assessment is based? And I'm going to come back to this point, that state assessments are based on hypothesized sequences of development. They're not based on research, they're based on consensus, but I will say more about this as we move forward. So, I've recently been suggesting in a number of my later publications that the teaching of language always involves the process of what I call curricularization. And when language is curricularized, it's treated not as a species-unique communicative system acquired naturally in the process of primary socialization. And as you may, of course, know, and maybe you've thought about it or maybe you haven't thought about it recently, all of us that are human beings acquire language. It's very rare. The condition of the human being has to be so different that they would not acquire that language that is used around them in the household by their parents and anyone that surrounds them. No one really teaches the language. They just use the language around the child, and the child will acquire that language. When people say, I don't speak Japanese, French, Spanish because my mother didn't teach me, what they're really saying is my mother didn't really speak to me in that language. If your mother had spoken to you in that language and expected you to understand, you would have acquired the language. That is how language works. I'm going to continue to talk about this a bit more because I always come down to the following idea. Languages are lived. Languages are lived. Right? So, when we turn it into a curriculum subject in a classroom, it becomes a body of knowledge or a skill, the elements of which are ordered and sequenced, practiced and studied, learned and tested in artificial contexts within which learners of the target language outnumber the proficient speakers. And I want to talk just a minute about this. Lily Wong Fillmore, who's one of the scholars who influenced me enormously in terms of second language acquisition, told us, or called to our attention, the fact that every time that we have a language teaching classroom, we have the following conditions. The learners outnumber the proficient speaker. There's usually only one proficient speaker in the room, maybe a few if we happen to have some children who are also speakers of whatever language we have. But in language classrooms, by definition, the learners outnumber the proficient speakers. And that is not a good condition for second language acquisition. Think about that for a moment. So, as we focus on equity for EL categorized students, we need to be able to compare, contrast, evaluate the multiple activities of what count as language teaching. So that's what I hope that we'll do at the end of my presentation.